Hi, everybody. This video is just going over how to estimate or determine your fill capacity for the different depths for those terrace tens. We've got a few different ways that we can estimate that or determine fill capacity. So the first way is a very general, basic kind of guideline that's not necessarily specific to your field. It is tailored towards the soil texture type for your field. But you have to remember that even within that soil type, there's a range of values and a range of percentages of textures. And so that can vary from field to field. And so this is really a general guideline. And I would suggest using this when you are just starting out with the sensors and you don't have a lot of data, to use that data to find your field capacity. But it's a good start and it's a good guideline. So it has its place, but I would definitely use your sensor data if you can. But so to start out with this particular option, if you just Google USU field capacity estimator, I can connect this or add this link to the description of this video. But this should pop up, and all you do is just select your soil texture for your field, and then select your crop, and then you can select the units that you prefer to see everything in. So, and then what it spits out, it says, okay, your fill capacity, or the point at which your soil profile is full of water, but not overflowing with water, right? They're saying is about 4.8 inches. And again, this is an estimation. I would say this probably leans more on the, let's just make sure they have plenty of water versus not enough. So this would be kind of your maximum amount of water that you would want to see with those terrace tens. And then the maximum allowable depletion, or the point at which you need to refill that soil profile or add water to before you get into any water stress that can negatively impact your yields. They're saying that is at 3.81 inches per foot of soil, right? So those are kind of the two main numbers I look at. And then if you want to read into this can kind of help you through an example and how to use that for irrigation. So it's a good starting point. So that's one way we can do it. If you have multiple irrigation events or multiple times where your pivot or your well line has gone over that sensor, or you flooded the field a few times, then you can kind of get in a better idea of fill capacity that's tailored specifically to the soil and to your field, the soil within your field. So I am in the customized charts area, this grid of squares. And this is a 6-month overview of soil moisture data. And what I'm going to do is talk through two different ways of determining fill capacity. So one is just simply looking at the trends of your terrace tens individually by depth. And then the other one is looking at your 6-inch water content with that 6-inch matric potential. And you can only do this with the 6-inch depth because they're at the same depth. So they're both beneficial. One might be a little bit more straightforward than the other, but I'm going to go over just looking at the trends of your water content to get a better idea of fill capacity for each depth for now. So I'm going to zoom in on a couple of different times where you see these sensors kind of spike in water content. That's kind of showing, okay, we've got a lot of water going through. And so it's a good indication of we're going to be able to find our fill capacity. The main thing I'm looking for is for a value that is similar between different irrigation events, and a value that kind of either plateaus or curves at the end of a spike like this. You'll see this spike, and then it drops down really fast, and then it kind of slows down, and then it drops down again. But so I'm going to zoom in on a couple of these. I generally don't look at the very first few irrigation events of the season because they're trying to refill the soil profile. And so it's not necessarily usually fill capacity at that point. But so if you just select a date range, whatever range you want, I'm going to look at first, this gray line is our 6-inch terrace 10. So you'll see where it spikes up and then drops down really fast. And then it's kind of starting to kind of slow that range. Oops. Sometimes it does that. Let's try that again. So we got a spike, and then it starts to see how it's that spike kind of slows down right here around 3.61, and it still drops. And then it kind of here around noon, it's a kind of another plateau, but not for very long. So let's see, this drop kind of spikes and drops around the same 3.59, so 3.6-ish. Now we're here around 3.64 where that spike ends. You could even say maybe it's really closer to 3.5 because it still's drawing down and then it's plateauing for a little bit in the middle of the day. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe this fill capacity is somewhere around 3.5 and 3.6. So here's another good example. It spikes, and then it kind of plateaus. But you also have to take in consideration the time of day because especially for that 6-inch, you're not going to have as much evaporation. Plants aren't going to be uptaking near as much water, right, at night. And so that's kind of why you see these steps in your water content each day. But we're going to just keep looking at a few. This must be after a cut or something, potential cut, or maybe you never know. Pivot may have broken down, so it dried down quite a bit. So they're trying to refill that profile. You can see that 6-inch draws down pretty fast, and it takes a minute for that 18-inch and 30-inch to come back up. So here's another big spike for that 6-inch, and we're at about 3.73, which is pretty high, but then it kind of plateaus around 3.62 right there. There's a 3.6 where it plateaus. So I'm gonna we're just looking at the trends. I'm gonna say let's put down that 3.6 for the fill capacity for that 6-inch depth. So now let's look at the 18-inch, which is the red line, and you just do the same thing. So I look for those spikes and then where it drops. So this is quite a bit higher. It's at 3.78, and then you've got kind of a plateau, but again, it's kind of in the middle of the night, and then it draws down. Let's look for another spike. Here's another spike. That's pretty high. There's a plateau right around that 3.7-ish that we were looking at. That's similar to here. It's not always crazy consistent. Weather can adjust, can, play a big factor into it. And whatnot. So you just kind of have to be patient and look at different events, different time periods, and see if you can kind of see a trend. So here's a little spike, draws down. I would say maybe somewhere around that 3.73. Here's a spike. And again, that's even lower, 3.4, 3.6. 3.64. So basically you're just looking at where it flattens out after a big spike. And it's harder sometimes, I've noticed, with the lower depths. It's a little bit harder to kind of estimate that fill capacity with those deeper depths. So here's a good indication. See where it spikes just a little bit, but then it's flat for a good amount of time. And even partway through the day. It's flat around 3.74. So that could be an indication of that's about where your fill capacity might be for that 18-inch depth. Again, it is an estimation, but hopefully you'll see some trends that are consistent throughout the year. And don't be afraid to tweak it if you feel like it's too high or too low. This is data for you to use and to adjust accordingly as you think is fit. So now we're going to look at that 30-inch depth, and 30-inch depths typically don't spike very much unless you're watering a ton, right? So it might be a little trickier to figure out that fill capacity for that deepest depth. But I know there were some spikes. We had one or two this year for this particular field. So you'll see some spikes here, and then it kind of draws down. So around 3.4, 0.6. See, this one's kind of more, you get kind of a slowing down around 3.72, but then it really slows down around 3.55-ish. So that's probably, I really only have one big spike to kind of go off of. So that's probably where I'll say that deepest depth field capacity value is. So these are kind of just your upper limits of saying, okay, I don't need to fill my profile more than this amount for this particular field, right? And alfalfa, obviously, you've got deeper depths. This is a crop with alfalfa, a field with alfalfa. So if you do go, get water down into those deeper depths, I don't think you're necessarily running into problems there, but it's just helpful to know what's my upper limits for these particular depths, right? So if I'm looking at, and then the third way of figuring out fill capacity with matric potential, again, it's only with the 6-inch. It's trying to see where that matric potential is about somewhere between -1 and -2-ish, I would think, and see what the water content is there. I have noticed it's not always not near as consistent. And it does seem to be quite a bit lower for that fill capacity. But if you notice what I like to look at, so here's a spike in the 6-inch, that gray line, that water content. And then you see that matrix potential stays at about -0.3 for quite a while as that soil's draining. So it's probably still potentially in saturation mode, right? And then it's starting to slowly become more and more negative, right? So that's another way to indicate your fill capacity is by comparing these two and seeing if you get about the same number, around that -1, -2, to see if that's your fill capacity. But again, it's not always consistent, as you can see. So that's kind of why I like to use the trends of just the water content. Because yeah, we're at 3.52. Here we were at 3.1 something. Here we're at 3.4. So it can change. But if you want to say, hey, my range of fill capacity is somewhere between maybe 3.5 and 3.65 for my 6-inch. I don't think, I think you're talking decimals at that point of difference, and that's probably just fine. So that's how you would calculate your fill capacity, but then figuring out, okay, but when do I need to turn water on so I'm not hitting any stress to my crop that could impact my yields? I really like to use the matrix potential. And if we had matrix potential at the 18-inch, that would be awesome too. The main thing that I have used is this, as you saw in the previous video, this figure table from Meter Group, and I'll add this into the description as well. This is a good table that shows, okay, these are the matrix potential ranges that you want your crops to be in kind of the happy zone of, we're not too water stressed, but we're not waterlogged. So we've got enough water to take in and grow and do what the crop needs to do, and just keep it as healthy as possible. So if you're growing alfalfa, a lot of people are growing alfalfa. Basically, you want to keep that matrix potential below, so between, as close to 0 or -1 or 2 and -150. And if you go below -150, so here, for example, we're seeing it go, see how it starts to kind of slope down, and then all of a sudden it just kind of dives. Oops. Sorry, guys. There we go. That's kind of a good indicator of, hey, I need to make sure I turn my water on before I get to -150, because then, you know, you have enough time for the pivot to come around to that sensor. You have enough time for the well lines to get to that sensor, and get water back on that field. So that's a good indicator of timing. But then figuring out how much to water what you do is say, okay, let's go somewhere in August. So let's do this time period here. So you see how right here, they were really close to that -150. So, so right before they turned on water, that 6-inch water content was at 2.79. And say, let's say our fill capacity is 3.6, right? So for that first foot, we want to make sure we have a little less than 1 inch of water, right? It's like almost 0.8 inches of water. So, and then you would say, okay, at that time frame, so August 11th at 8 a.m., you can come to those other terrace 10s and say, okay, what's my water content here for my 18-inch and my 30-inch, and how much do I need to get to those particular fill capacity values? And then you can say, this is how much I need to add. This is how much I need to be putting on my field to get to fill capacity. So, you know, for that first debt, 3.6 minus 2.8, right? And then that second debt, we'll say I can't remember what we said, but maybe 3.7 minus 2.86, and then 2.97 minus 3.55, or the opposite. And then you add those together, and that's how much you need to add. With pivots, you know, if that's too much water at one time, obviously do what you need to do. Maybe spoon feed it or do a couple passes, but that's kind of how we use these numbers and these sensors to make irrigation decisions. And in upcoming videos, we'll show how to make these customized charts, make max and min ranges for your fill capacity and refill points, and then also how to set alerts so it can kind of ping you and tell you, hey, you know, your matric potential is getting low, time to turn on water. So you're not necessarily having to be looking at this all the time, but hopefully you've got notifications turned on so it can tell you when things are getting low. So hope that's helpful. Feel free to leave any comments below, or reach out if you have any questions, and we'll talk to you later.